Hello, I'm Caitlin Robb. I recently graduated from Gray's School of Art. I do a variety of mediums, from drawing to printmaking to analog photography to ceramics and installation, and I do a little bit of poetry as well. At the moment, I'm focused on rituals around death, but also respecting and showing reverence to animals who have died because of humanity, and showing reverence to them when they haven't received any compassion from us in the past. I started researching about death and spirituality, like the rituals, from a book by Caitlin Doughty. She's a mortician in America, I think, but she made some great books. One that I liked in particular, which is all about rituals of different countries and how they honor the dead. There was rituals such as in, it's not in the Philippines, but in that area, and people believe that the dead are not dead until they're buried. So they keep the dead around for like months, maybe even years, and in their home, and they look after them, and it's kind of like they almost mummify. And I just found that really interesting how different that is to us, whereas we're like very quick with the turnover for when the dead are dealt with, you know, in the Western side of the world. So then I was thinking about how our past ancestors dealt with the dead. And I found out that they were very involved in the process, and how they had rituals of their own, and how they had little beliefs. So they had to make sure that they had to do those things. So for example, covering mirrors, or feeding the body to the birds so that the spirit would leave and not cause the living any problems or anything. So I just found that very interesting. And that's and I just thought it would develop my practice more, instead of just it be bones and other things. But yeah, just having bones and stuff, it's got more of a depth to my practice by involving these sort of rituals and such. I don't use any digital media. I mean, apart from at the moment I have to scan in my film because I don't have an access to a darkroom. But I primarily focus on traditional processes. So things like etching, using a copper plate, printmaking, other printmaking styles like screen printing and stuff. Instead of using a printer, I use nibs for drawing with. I use making ceramic molds, instead of 3D printing something. And also ceramics does have a very ritualistic nature because it comes from the earth, and literally comes from the earth. So I think, yes, they're very different, but they connect in their ritualistic manner, and how I have to be very hands-on and take time to do it. Analog photography is a huge example, because digital, you click and then you can see your photo straight away. Whereas analog, you have to take the photos, then process the film, then either scan it and then print it, or go to a darkroom and do that process. Whereas digital, it's just a one-click wonder. Which is great, and it's wonderful that brings people to photography. But for me, I think taking the time to actually process what I'm doing and being hands-on with it is really lovely. It is really difficult in a time where places are closed, that I can't access, things like dark rooms and stuff. But I have adjusted, so I make my bathroom a little processing area for my films, so I can make it so it's not gonna get exposed anymore. And then from there I'll scan it, but I would like to return to darkroom at some point. I have many influences, but I'm just going to talk about a few. So there's an artist who was around in the 1600s called Frederick Ruch. He was a bit more of a scientist rather than an artist per se, but he basically kept a lot of specimens. But he compiled them in a beautiful way. So he made these sculptures, which now don't exist sadly because of time and stuff. But he made these sculptures with fetal skeletons. So if you don't know, baby skeletons, which is horrible. That a baby didn't really get to appreciate the joys and the trials of life. But he made these beautiful wonders that gave a sense of life to them and gave them a purpose, which I just found really poetic and beautiful. He's kind of discussing about the shortness of life as well, with these sculptures that he did. But now there's a lot of illustrations. So you'll see more, if you look at Frederick Ruch, you'll see more of the drawings of these sculptures, which are beautiful themselves because they're very detailed and very well done, depicting these sculptures that Frederick Ruch made. I primarily focus on skeletal work. So I own a bunch of animal skulls, but I found it really interesting because I was writing my dissertation on rituals and the taboo of the Western world. But I was looking at Joe Peter Witkin, and I was looking at Sally Mann and her Body Farm series, and also this artist called Bayard, who was around, I think it was the 1800s, who did a self-portrait of himself being a corpse, which I found really interesting and really thought-provoking. And it was about a betrayal of a friend, daguerre. You probably have heard of daguerreotypes, which is an old process of film, but actually Bayard made a film process quite similar before daguerre. But daguerre and him were friends, and basically daguerre got to the people first about his process. So yeah, anyway, it was betrayal anyway, but it was really interesting how the corpse can be shown in different ways, because Bayard, it was more of a political protest, whereas Witkin used it very much as a blank canvas, the corpse, to manipulate the body, to depict things from literature, mythology, etc. Whereas Mann was a bit more just depicting a body farm. I've got a whole variety of artists that have inspired me, but one in particular is Gabriel Rothko. He's a Mexican artist who's done a whole variety of works, but a few pieces that I've enjoyed by him are Black Kites, which is it's a human skull, a real human skull that he spent several months drawing on a checkered pattern with just graphite pencil, so just regular pencil, and he's made this beautiful piece so it's the human skull with a checker pattern on it, but he's really honored the shape and the contours of the skull, which I found really interesting and beautiful. But it's just how he spent that time facing death and drawing on it that really fascinated me. And just really simply just taking the time and really appreciating the dead with that piece. He also did a series called Obit. So he collected obituary titles. So if you ever look at the obituaries, there'll often be like a title saying like, what they were. And so he collected them and then he showed them like a very simple manner, but it's just really lovely. And like, instead of like sharing the names of the people, he just shared what these people did, which was really fascinating. So like, for example, like infectious disease expert, saved millions from blindness, wartime foe of Mussolini, really interesting like titles that he collected over a period of time, but it was really fascinating that he made that piece. Honoring the dead, but not like by name, but by identity. There's a painting by Sir James Guthrie, again, an old artist from the 1800s. And he depicted what funerals were like at the time. And it was all men in this funeral. And it was just really interesting how, like, that's another thing about rituals of past is that, like, women used to be involved in the process, like, before this image. And it was really interesting how, like, this image depicts a time where people thought that only men should go because like women would be too emotional, or they were like, oh, it's not a nice thing for women to see, like they're too fragile or whatever. So it's really interesting looking at that painting and seeing how, times have changed, but also like what people used to think. And it was just kind of like an eye into the past, which I really loved seeing. My whole life I'm fueled by feminism. Like, if I wasn't, I would be a completely different person. I think, like, our society has taught women to see themselves as little compared to men. And like, I disagree, honestly, but also like feminism for me isn't just about women, it's about all of us, like creating a better world for each other and respecting each other and like holding all of us, like if you're a man, if you're a woman, if you're non-binary, if you are transgender, like accepting all of us. And I think like my work, like, yes, it isn't about like that, but it's also about like I accept animals as well, because I'm a vegan as well. So I think my feminism and veganism are connected because it's, for me, it's about respecting like all beings and being kind to each other and showing empathy. So I think my work does, even though it doesn't anymore quite physically talk about feminism or veganism. Well, I mean, it does a little bit of veganism, but I think like showing compassion to each other, I think that's where my work comes from. I think it's wonderful that people make work about feminist issues, and like, I think that's wonderful, and like I will always appreciate seeing those works, but you don't have to be an artist and feminist that makes that stuff. You can be an artist and feminist who makes like anything. And I think, like, I think that's important to remember too. But you also don't have to make work about feminism that is like that kind of range of like, burning bras or whatever. It can be much more subtle if you want it to be. Like, it can be about the female body, or it can be like literally about just compassion. The world is your oyster. In 2018, my tutor gave me a roe deer skeleton. What you see is a cabinet with floating bones. And then there's also some prints onto the glass as well. And there's some like a moss floor as well. So yeah, it's kind of where the project started. So like since third year, I've basically been working on like death and showing respect to the animals as well. This piece was really interesting because it was inspired by, I don't know if you remember from earlier, but I talked about a ritual of Scotland where people fed the body to the birds to relieve the spirit from the body, because it was about like allowing the living to like keep living and not be disturbed by the dead and such. So that's kind of what the piece is about. So there's some, the piece had some bones at the ground, but it also had bones rising to kind of like envisage the spirit leaving the body, like floating, you know, floating away. What I wanted to portray is that sort of like, you know, having to face death and like, you know, kind of going like, oh, I want to look closer because I need to know what it is. And then kind of realizing what it is and kind of being like, you realize that you're this close. Sorry, I covered my face there. This close to the dead. It was also in a very small space, which depicted kind of like the catacombs in like places like the Paris catacombs and such. But the piece came from, yes, the catacombs, but also came from the idea of the ritual in Bolivia, and I think some other places too, called the Ñatitas. It's basically where people found skulls and kept them in their homes, and they believed that skulls would give them wisdom on certain things. So people would own like, sometimes people would own like just one skull, but some people would own like 20 skulls, and they would name them and they would like associate them with a particular thing. So for example, like, you know, let's name a skull Paul. Paul, you would go to Paul for like a finance issue. Basically, it's all about like how they go to the spirit for guidance. And I kind of associated that with the tarot. That's why I put the decals on of the tarot. I basically made the catacomb with these slip casted skulls that I made, which I did through a plaster casting process. So basically I made the mold with plaster, and then I made the slip cast, and then I fired them and stuff, which was a very long process. And then I decided to like decorate them with decals, which is like basically prints that you can put onto the skull. So it's kind of like similar to temporary tattoos, the way you put it on. But yeah, I chose the tarot to kind of depict that sort of idea of like going to the dead for advice and such. Yeah, that's where the piece kind of comes from. This time last year, I did a whole exhibition, which is crazy to think about now. Yeah, so it was called Reverence, to show respect to the dead. Like it was a really interesting like exhibition for me to do because it was a solo exhibition that I just made myself. Like it wasn't, you know, anyone else, there wasn't anyone else showing, which I never had before because I always, you know, was in like group showings at like Grays and stuff, which was wonderful too, but it was a really great learning experience for me to learn how to, you know, set up an exhibition, like be in charge of posters, being in charge of like how it will be displayed, putting it up yourself, you know, all those things. But yeah, no, it was about reverence towards animals. So I did like I had prints, like I had photographic prints. I had drawings that I did by hand myself. I had some of the ceramic skulls, both rabbit and roe deer. It was a really interesting body of work for me. And I think because it was in January as well, it was important because January can be quite a time of like reflection and thinking about those we've lost because it's another year and stuff. I mean, my family in particular, I never met him, but my grandfather passed away in the new year, one year. So I think I've always been taught that it's kind of a time to think about those you've lost and such. So I think that's partly why I chose that time to exhibit my work. I'm wanting to be a like independent artist with a multidisciplinary practice. And I would like to do more of this sort of work about death and showing respect to animals. There's a piece I really want to do. It would be a photographic series of getting people to interact with the dead. So I kind of made a trial run already with some people from Grays, where I basically got people to choose a skull and hold it. And I captured this kind of like interaction between the living and the dead. It's kind of a transitional period at the moment. But I've just got a studio, which I'm going to move into soon. Exciting for me to be able to have a space to go to again to make work and be around other artists. So a lot of plate spinning, but it's good though. It's good to kind of like keep my mind going and keep me going, you know.